Tonight we have, I think, a very courageous man who's come to speak to us. Dr. Lee Hsien Loong was a neuropsychologist. He was a professional medical person, but he saw the call of democracy in Singapore. And he has a wife and 3 children. His wife is here with us tonight. We're graced with her presence. And afterwards we're going to offer to you anyone who wants to buy his book, but we'll come to that. Dr. Chi, as I said, has a courageous background. He was leader of the Singapore Democratic Party, and as such, and because of his agitations in Singapore, he was jailed on numerous occasions in Singapore. It's said that Lee Kuan Yew thoroughly approved of Deng Xiaoping's statement that it didn't matter, after Tiananmen, that it wouldn't matter if 200,000 Chinese students were killed. Anything like that to keep the country together was better than nothing at all. And of course, Dr. Chi would have thoroughly disapproved of that. He was sacked as a lecturer by the National University of Singapore when he joined the SDP and took part in the elections in 1992. He was also censured by the Singapore Parliament and fined by a parliamentary select committee. He's been imprisoned, as I said, more than a dozen times for repeatedly challenging the PAP's curbs on political freedom. Tonight, Dr. Chi is going to talk about Singapore and where it's going and what's happened to it. And we're also, I think, very pleased, I'm pleased to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Miles Cooper here, who Mr. Miles Cooper, well, His Excellency Miles Cooper, who was our last High Commissioner in Singapore. Miles and I have been around the traps many, many times together, and we enjoyed the 70th birthday 3-day celebrations of our colleague John Macbeth, the former Far East Economic Review Bureau Chief, but that's by the way. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, here is Dr. Chi.
Thank you, Dr. Brunowski. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the Australia Institute for International Affairs for giving me this opportunity to address you this evening. Last week, I spoke at the University of Sydney and talked about the decline of living standards and quality of life in Singapore. I focused on Lee Kuan Yew's insistence that Singapore is too small to produce a credible opposition that can challenge his party for political power. Now, I don't intend to repeat that presentation except to say that Singaporeans are increasingly disenchanted with the ruling People's Action Party, and more significantly, making their unhappiness known. In February 2013, there was a protest against the government's plans to bring in foreigners into the country to augment our population size from the current 5 million to 7 million. Unremarkable in Australia, perhaps, and other democracies, this protest rally was historic in an island silenced by decades of autocratic rule. Now, if I showed you this picture, you would never guess that it is Singapore. But in December last year, a riot, the first in half a century, broke out in the district that we call Little India. Security vehicles were overturned and torched, and dozens of police personnel were injured. Last year, hackers from an online group who call themselves Anonymous hacked into the Straits Times, the leading government-run newspaper, and posted anti-government messages. This young man was prosecuted for organizing the Million Mask March in opposition to new regulations that will curtail internet use. 15 people joined him and donned the Guy Fawkes mask and gathered in downtown Singapore. Last month, Singaporeans awoke to a sign that was spray painted on the roof of a block of flats with expletives against the ruling party. How they managed to get up to that rooftop is still a mystery, but the expletives there really speak for themselves. Soon after this incident, another individual defaced several bus stop signs protesting against the withholding of our CPF savings, the Central Provident Fund, pension savings in Singapore. A 71-year-old man was arrested for the deed. Now, in Singapore, vandalism is not treated the way that I think Australians are treated here. If caught and convicted, you stand to go to jail and worse, be caned. Bloggers, both anonymous and otherwise, are coming out in droves to point out the follies and foibles of the government, who seems to be in a rather cooperative mood in providing the fodder. Now, all these, perhaps run-of-the-mill occurrences in a democracy like Australia, are unprecedented in Singapore. For nearly half a century, under the heavy hand of an authoritarian government, Singaporeans have become known more for our docility than defiance. But things are beginning to change. As I've described, all this has taken place within the past year or so, and they are occurring with increasing frequency. They represent a generation of Singaporeans who are quite fed up with a one-party state that does not and cannot fulfill their growing aspirations. Unfortunately, Singapore's Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, his response to all this has been, to put it mildly, less than reassuring. In the 2006 general elections, he told the crowd at a rally, Singapore, suppose you had 10, 15, 20 opposition members in parliament. Now, instead of spending my time thinking what is the right policy for Singapore, I'm going to spend all my time thinking what's the right way to fix them, to buy my supporters' votes. He later claimed that he misspoke. By the 2011 general elections, his tone had changed considerably. Now he says, I hope you will understand when these problems vex you or disturb you or upset your lives. Please bear with us. We are trying our best on your behalf. And if we didn't get it quite right, I'm sorry, but we will try better the next time. No government is perfect. We will make mistakes. I think you've got used to our style. We spend time to talk, to explain. Unfortunately, the contrition was short-lived as Lee's administration reverted to its old ways. In 2013, an independent filmmaker came under investigation when she video recorded the statements of 4 bus drivers who had gone on strike because of low wages, and then said that they were beaten up while under police custody. A cartoonist was threatened with contempt proceedings over a comic he posted on his website that poked fun at the judicial system. A political commentator was also charged with scandalizing the judiciary when he alleged that the court registry had manipulated hearing dates to favor the government's case. A 21-year-old activist was sued for defamation by the Ministry of Education when she criticized practices by lecturers and staff in an international college in which she had studied. A former member of my party, the Singapore Democratic Party, was sued for defamation when he criticized the Minister for Manpower. Most recently, a 33-year-old blogger activist was sued by Mr. Lee Hsien Loong when he accused the Prime Minister of impropriety over the retention of the workers' CPF savings. The defendant was later sacked by the hospital at which he worked. This happened in just the past week or so. It is actions like these that make people disparage the PM's expressions of contrition. They make him look insincere, and his apologies are viewed with cynicism, put out only as a vote-getting exercise. He doesn't seem to understand that you can only fool the people so many times. And when that faith and trust is lost, it is very hard to get them back. He doesn't seem to realize, or if he does, is not able to incorporate these changes into his strategy, that political circumstances have changed. Technology has changed. And most important, the mood of the people has changed. He insists on employing the tactics his father used. The difference is that defamation suits, the threats of prosecution and the warnings of contempt proceedings are met with anger and even hostility instead of fear and cowering. The more the government resorts to such actions, the louder the criticisms get. In a way, Lee is paying for the consequences of his father's policies and politics. Take, for example, our economic policies. Since the 1960s, Singapore has depended on foreign investments, relying on multinational corporations to supply jobs for Singapore and to generate GDP growth. The domestic sector of the economy is dominated by a plethora of government-linked companies, or GLCs as we call it, operated by Temasek Holdings, a conglomerate whose CEO is Ho Ching, wife of the Prime Minister. Now, the MNC GLC combination has created an economic structure that has crowded out local entrepreneurs. As a result, we have been unable to develop a knowledge-driven economy able to compete on ideas and innovation on the global stage. In fact, Singapore's economic growth has largely been due to what economist and Nobel laureate Paul Krugman call input-driven growth, where GDP expansion is largely the result of the government extracting revenue from the populace and plowing it back into building in the infrastructure. Little of the growth is coming from creative production and knowledge-based industries. Such an economic arrangement will lead to a state of diminishing returns and, as you can quite well imagine, ultimately unsustainable. We are witnessing the beginning of such a slowdown, and gone are the days where GDP accelerated at breakneck speeds. The education system is another one of the major failings of the PAP. This was admitted, perhaps unwittingly, by Lee Kuan Yew himself. In 2008, Lee told the media that, quote, without foreigners, the jobs will not be there to begin with, unquote. The current Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, reiterated this view in 2011. He said, without foreign workers, we would not have attracted investments, unquote. This is perhaps the biggest indictment of the PAP government. It has had more than half a century uninterrupted to educate the populace. Yet it has not been able to equip the people with the talent, knowledge, and creativity to ensure the survival of our economy without having to depend on foreigners. Not only are Singaporeans unable to generate jobs for our own people, local talent is leaving the country in alarming numbers. Lee Kuan Yew pointed out that about 1,000 Singaporeans are leaving the city-state for other countries every year, and the number is growing. 1,000 may not sound like a lot to a big population like in Australia, where you're about 30 million people. But in Singapore, of 3 million, that's a huge number. He added that, quote, every year there are more people going abroad for their first or second degree, and many of them are not coming back. Now, these people make up the top 4 or 5% of skilled Singaporeans that our economy desperately needs. How do we come to such a state where our education system cannot keep our best and brightest at home, or after they leave, attract them back? But instead of taking a good hard look at where it has gone wrong with its education policies, the PAP has decided in its immigration policy to bring in foreigners to replace Singaporeans. In 2013, the government published its white paper on population growth, and announced that it would increase our population size, as I mentioned, from currently 5 million to 7 million by bringing in yet more foreigners, even though we are the third most densely populated city in the world. Such a pronouncement did not sit well with Singaporeans, of course, and it caused a considerable backlash against the government. Now, not only are its policies not in sync with the aspirations of the people, Lee Hsien Loong's politics is also out of step. The autocratic system put in place over the last half a century has ensured that the people in Singapore cannot and dare not exercise critical, independent thinking, thereby contributing to the dearth of innovators and entrepreneurs. Observers unfamiliar with such developments see only the glitter and think that Singapore is a success story, that it just needs a bit of a tweaking here and there to make a good system even better. But the truth is that the policies enacted without scrutiny and debate have wrought incalculable damage to Singapore, perhaps not yet apparent. The losses in terms of talent, national identity, and creative potential, losses that are unquantifiable, will cost Singapore dearly in the years to come. In 2001, I said in a talk at Stanford University that we must not ignore the lack of democracy in Singapore despite the economic growth that we were going through. I said then that without an open and transparent system that democracy ensures, policies cannot be scrutinized and policymakers cannot be held accountable. I also made the point that the center in the post-Lee Kuan Yew era cannot hold if Singapore does not graduate into a democracy by then. This observation on both counts seems to be on course to becoming true. The policies made in an era where Parliament was shorn of an opposition have now come back to haunt us, and the politics of denuding the country of a political opposition and civil society has left us vulnerable, especially under Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, who seems, despite the clear indications, unable and unwilling to take the country down the democratic path. It is true that Lee has instituted policy adjustments of late, but these changes have largely been cosmetic, designed only to make the government look like it is listening, but in fact, continuing with its policies in autocratic ways. More importantly, Singaporeans are not buying it. They see through the condescension and patronizing overtures, and they want none of it. If the PM is going to genuinely listen to the people and respond to a changing economy, a changing community, he needs to do a few things. First, he needs to release the control over the media. All the newspapers, all the TV stations, all the radio stations in Singapore continue to be owned and run by the government. 2, he needs to reform the election process. We still have gerrymandering that is not like those that you see over here. We don't know of the constituencies until quite close to the elections, and even then we're only given 9 days to campaign. Thirdly, he needs to abolish the Public Order Act, which allows the government, the police, to identify even a single person conducting a protest or demonstration in a public area and to be able to arrest and detain him or her. Interestingly enough, when the act was introduced, the Minister for Law had cited a law in Australia here. I think there was this term called the Move On Act, where any person deemed to be breaking the law and the police told you to move on, you had to move on. So I fear that Australia here, you're not teaching our government some very good things. Fourth, the government must stop suing its critics and charging for contempt of court. And finally, they must return workers their rights to organize freely. Now, the PAP can continue to gerrymander the electoral boundaries, hand out monetary packages just before voting, or use the state media to smear its opponents, and then claim a resounding victory at elections. However, it must know that there is a significant segment of the population, the minority though it may be, that is watching developments and growing increasingly frustrated and restive at the lack of change. When the limit is passed and the lid pops, no amount of repressive tactics will be able to contain the anger. The people will not sit by and see their hopes of establishing a democratic and accountable government dashed for another 5 years. Former Foreign Minister George Yeo, whom I'm sure many of you know, said during the 2011 general elections, perhaps out of desperation, he said, "We must recognize that there is widespread unhappiness about the government. It is not only about specific policies, it's more than that. And we cannot allow those emotions to be bottled up. We need a transformed PAP." He seems to understand what John F. Kennedy once said: those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. International investments and interests that Singapore has so painstakingly cultivated all these years and decades will also be casualties if the ruling party remains intransigent to the call for transparency and democratic accountability. An economically and politically directionless Singapore serves no one's interest. 20 or 30 years ago, Asia was largely under autocratic regimes. But as you know, the political terrain has altered dramatically. Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and even Burma have moved decisively towards democracy or are in the process of doing so. Singapore is among the last few holdouts that refuse to open up. But the international community has paid scant regard to the situation in Singapore. A Singapore that labors under an autocratic regime, unwilling to meet the people's aspirations, is not one that will be at its functioning best. It is in everyone's interest, including the international community, that Singapore manages a successful transition to democracy. Lee Hsien Loong's disinclination to reform politics is saddled with his father's political take-no-prisoners approach. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is 90 years old, but shows no willingness to usher in a less autocratic style of governance. The PAP's current tactics to continue the type of strong-arm, one-party politics is, however, at complete variance with the aspirations of the Singaporean people. The two sets of interests are on a collision course. In such a matter of the people versus the PAP, the outcome is not in question. But how the ruling party responds and how much it resists the changes demanded by Singaporeans will determine how badly Singapore is damaged in the process. To be very sure, the PAP still has a formidable array of weapons at its disposal to continue its one-party rule and to deny the democratization of Singapore. But on this, I am reminded of what 19th century French poet Victor Hugo once said: "Nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come." Thank you.
Thank you. Very powerful stuff, Dr. Chi. Thank you so much for a lucid account of your interpretation of the present situation in Singapore. Let me ask you the first question, and that is, I'd like to relate what you've said to the recent Shangri-La first-tier conference of defence ministers in Singapore at the Shangri-La Hotel. It's been going since 2002. It's one of the two most important mechanisms we have in the region to look at defence issues. 28 countries appeared. Do you think, sir, that your interpretation of the shortcomings in the democratic process in Singapore will eventually filter through to some of the leaders of those countries, and that they may feel perhaps Singapore is not the best place to have an international conference of such a serious nature about what we should do in the region? Or will there be no effect? Because many of the other countries, of course, are at least as autocratic as Singapore. Would you like to come up and... Sure. I'll just stand at the side, please. Take the mic.
I think as long as these conference participants, meaning some of these governments, are not disabused of what's going on in Singapore, which is not readily apparent just from the outside looking in, they will continue to organize such conferences in Singapore. One good example would be an institution like the International Bar Association. This huge association that decided to come to Singapore and have its conference in Singapore in 2007, if my memory serves me correctly. And they were on the verge of setting up an Asian office in Singapore. When I read about it, I decided to participate because on the last day of the conference, they organized a rule of law symposium. But in any case, I went through quite a bit just to be present at the symposium, not as a speaker, but as a member of the audience. And over there, I stood up and I just started telling the audience that what was happening in Singapore, that we still had the Internal Security Act that had detained and continues to detain citizens without trial. I was just told politely just not to continue, but I insisted, and very soon I got the support of the audience, wanting to hear more of it. And to cut a long story short, eventually the IBA decided that its Human Rights Institute that decided that they would do a study on Singapore and the human rights situation in Singapore and published a report. And since then, I don't think it has then come back to want to have its Asia office there. In its opening session, it invited Lee Kuan Yew to speak and had huge amount of praises. And Lee Kuan Yew reciprocated and said IBA was such an important organization and so on and so forth. Until the IBA then issued its report and his views changed and he started criticizing the organization. So just to give you an idea, international organizations and governments still know very little about Singapore, and because sometimes this lack of knowledge tend to want to come to Singapore to do business with with the government.
Stay there. I open the discussion to the floor now. Questions, please. Anyone? In the front here, this gentleman. Please state your name and then ask your question.
My name is Teck Ling. Thank you very much for that comprehensive speech. It was very good for you to enlighten us. I heard that even the PAP doesn't trust the Singaporean people, and to get new MPs, they're even recruiting new people, like a lot of Indians who got PR to sign on and become a PAP members. How true is that? And the other thing is that Singapore is the the eye that the West has seen as that Asia should follow. And I know the fact that you have described the lack of democracy, but it is something that even Australia and the United States had said that Asia should follow the model that LKY is perpetuating. What do you think?
I talked a little bit about the immigration policy and the huge numbers that the government is letting in. I hope no one in this room misunderstands me or thinks that somehow we are much like the BNP or even the UKIP in London, where we're right-wing xenophobes. The situation in Singapore is hugely different. I talked about Lee Kuan Yew citing the fact that Singaporeans are leaving in droves. They have not bothered. He has not bothered to examine policies on why Singaporeans are leaving. Many Singaporeans cite the highly stressful situation, living conditions in Singapore, the education system, and the lack of democracy. And yet, instead of opening up society to retain Singaporeans, he's decided to embark on bringing in foreigners. And I said to replace Singaporeans. That's not an exaggeration. And this has caused so much anxiety and anguish among Singaporeans. And they've come to the stage where the ruling party is recruiting. I hear of this as well, but I cannot independently confirm it. That non-Singaporeans are also recruited to be into its ranks. I'm very curious to find out if that is true or not. But that's the situation that we're in right now, and we need to address this before it really gets out of hand. Singaporeans are just really at the very angry at this matter, and they have made their anger known. To address the point about the West looking to Asia, and in particular Singapore, that is what I was referring to. Singapore continues to be held up as the poster boy of development, albeit without democracy, but so what? I had a meeting with a State Department official in 2004, I think, when I was in Washington, D.C. And he basically, I approached him and said, like, look, the U.S. talks much about human rights and democracy. Why is it that we hear so little of it, or at least there is no active approach on this matter towards the Singapore government? Well, the official very candidly told me that, look, the government is elected to represent the interests of the American people. And in the U.S. interest, it is trade and security as far as Singapore is concerned. I've been trying to make the point that democracy and trade and security are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it is necessary for that to be, for us to have this sustainable, long-term development in trade, in security issues. I'm not sure if anything has registered since, but I fear again that this ignorance will continue, will persist until something drastic in Singapore happens, and then everybody sits up and listens, by which time it may be too late. And what's going on around the world is just a sad reflection of how I think diplomacy is carried out. And I'm saying this from my experience as an opposition member in Singapore.
Jeff Miller? Wait for the mic, sir.
Thank you. Jeff Miller, I'm a member of the Institute. I just wanted to make a comment in a way. Like many Australians, I've visited Singapore a number of times, and on a recent occasion was talking to someone from Southeast Asia who settled in Singapore, And I said to him, you know, how do you manage? How do you find it here? Isn't it very authoritarian and from the top down? He said, well, I've got a couple of young children and I've been thinking about Singapore, and from the point of view of a child, Singapore is very good. The kids have a very good education, they have access to very good health services, and they're safe. It's a secure place. And so he said, I decided, therefore, to put aside my concerns about freedom of speech, etc., etc. And I just wonder, I mean, do you think most of the Singapore population still thinks in that way?
Let me just quickly address the point about people coming to Singapore and wanting their children to receive education there. I presented some statistics last week when I gave the talk, thank you. Many people still don't know this, that nearly a quarter of students, children, aged between 6 and 12, you're talking about primary school, elementary school, have entertained thoughts of killing themselves. And this is due to the very stressful curriculum that we have in Singapore. At age 12, year 6, you sit for a final examination at the primary school level, and that will determine, based on your score, which stream you enter when you go to secondary school. And that stream will then take you on to junior college. And if you succeed, then you go to university. Many of these students actually act out these tendencies. And unfortunately, we have quite a few real-life cases where 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds get onto the top of the buildings and jump to their deaths and openly say that they don't want to do any more homework. I do keep telling people, you know, when you look at Singapore, I think what really attracts them is the glitter, right? You look at Marina Bay Sands, for those of you who've been, it's so attractive. What could be wrong with a system as gleaming as what you see in Singapore? The streets are clean, the parks are manicured. What could possibly be wrong? And so they get enticed by all these very superficial, the facade, and then come to this conclusion, wrong conclusion, that everything is okay and therefore they want to be in Singapore. Now, as far as what Singaporeans think of this, I think we've been through the system and we know it. We know it. Many of Singaporeans have left Singapore precisely because they don't want the children to go through the education that we have. Many of them are here in Singapore, and I've met them, and they're saying so glad that they got out of it. And this is what I keep telling people in the international community. It really is a case of look before you leap.
Question over here.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Chi, thank you.
Microphone.
Both,
Who you are.
both what you've said this evening and what you said at Sydney University last week, which was similar. And in fact, I think already I can anticipate your response to my question. But I've been reading Kishore Mahbubani's book called The Great Convergence. And of course, he was a former foreign minister of Singapore. And his view of Singapore in that book describes a country that might be somewhere else from the one that you're describing. He says, for instance, that the world is converging around peace and development and the growth of a middle class, and that all of this is optimistic. This optimism is at its height in Asian countries, and that, as he said in his previous books, is what is drawing the world towards what he calls the new Asian hemisphere. And I'd like to have your opinion about, because I have to write about this book soon, is whether Mahbubani is into the same kind of propaganda and presentation, public presentation to the world of Singapore that you've described, or whether there's anything of accuracy in what he's talking about.
Mr. Mahbubani is, if I recall correctly, the same person who said that the Singapore government has eradicated poverty.
That's the one.
And I haven't got the slides here to show or that I presented last week. Poverty in Singapore is hidden. Al Jazeera did just recently a very good documentary on Singapore that you don't see it on the streets. It's not because there is no poverty, but because the government is just that much more efficient in making sure that it cleans up and ushers away some of these homeless people. And that is why I fear that it's this kind of hubris that Mr. Mahbubani puts forward that gives this false sense of development that I think is very obviously misplaced. But I think when they talked about the Asian century, and even the US president was pivoting towards Asia, they missed that big point, is that similar to Singapore, China is also developing, minus democracy. And if you were to read again beyond the headlines about the kind of GDP growth and so on and so forth that China is achieving, one would also be very worried, and rightly so. There's very little transparency. You never know the statistics coming out from Beijing, whether they're legitimate. And talk to some of the economists, the people and the analysts that have worked in China, and there is a very big concern in this area here. And we're also seeing security problems, isn't it, with China flexing its muscles and getting into this tiff with Vietnam over some of the islands in Southeast Asia, and Philippines is getting in on the altercation as well. I'm not sure that there is the kind of optimism. Of course, everybody would like to paint a rosier picture of the region, but without democracy and without people being close to the heart of some of these governments, it really, we can be told that the sun is going to rise tomorrow from the west and not be any more knowledgeable.
Gentleman here, introduction please, and use the mic.
I'm Miles Cooper. I lived in Singapore from 2005 to 2008 and endeavoured to follow developments there. At that time, I had a sense that the Singapore government, which had a lot of very clever people at its top, they told us they were clever, and that they did have some inkling of the stirrings within society, and that they did make some tiny steps to accommodate that. But they calibrated their responses fairly skillfully. The picture you've presented, and I think it's a pretty fair one, is that since then how should I put it, the understanding of what's going on in the broader society has not been that deft, and their responses haven't been that deft. They've been at least 2 or 3 steps behind the emerging opinion. Now, what do you think, if I might ask, are the prospects for them to keep up with emerging trends in public thinking? Will they be deft enough to adjust accordingly, or will the ruling family remain in its current mode of operation and not keep up with things? And within the PAP, are there individuals, and I'm thinking of a couple of particular ones, who do understand what's going on? You mentioned George Yeo. And will they have the capacity to change the PAP and its responses so that it can stay in power? Is the PAP capable of renewing itself?
I've said this before, and I stand by it. as long as Lee Kuan Yew is physically present, there will be no meaningful political change. I am not sure if Lee Hsien Loong has the wherewithal to defy his father. At the moment, all indications are that he is going down the road that his father had paved years ago. As for individuals within the PAP having just a little bit more foresight, different people that have mentioned different names, but they work and they dance around the periphery, not really willing to engage and tell it like it is. What Giorgio said a little while ago when I cited it, he was fighting the battle of his life in an election, and I suspect that he would say anything just to make sure that he held his seat. But I do believe too that somebody like Giorgio will just have just a little bit more intellect about him, right? To be able to see that people are clamoring for change, and that if you're a student of history, you want to be on the right side of it because the tide is turned. The political landscape, as I mentioned, in Asia has moved decisively towards democracy, and he cannot, as foreign minister, not have been aware of that. But I come back to the point that with Lee Kuan Yew around, I don't think anybody has the courage to stand up within PAP and say, we've got to make the and then go out and make the change. Lee Hsien Loong has a wonderful opportunity to leave behind his legacy, and in fact, if he was wise enough to leave behind his father's legacy, right? PAP has been in power for more than 50 years. Why not? Why not democratize, open up society, and then make virtue out of a necessity, right? And then say that, look, I'm opening up society, we are on this glasnost or this perestroika and so on. And that would really etch the legacies in Singapore's history. But unfortunately, maybe autocrats don't think the same way that normal people do.
A question over here from Sophie, please. Please say who you are. You?
My name is Cherie Wax. Many times in the past, Australian politicians of all persuasions have been quite happy to selectively criticise regimes they perceive to be authoritarian, though I can't recall any of them ever doing that with Singapore. Since you've been here, have you had any meetings with any of our politicians? And if so, have you found any of them to be receptive to your arguments?
I really am not looking for politicians in another country to criticize my government. We need to make change. And I believe with all my heart that that change needs to be made by Singaporeans and no one else. And we are more than capable of making that reform. What I've been asking, making the point of the international community, politicians from overseas, is that they need also to pay attention to what was going on and not make vacuous statements that absolutely make no sense, and continue to draw attention to this so-called Singapore model. Because you're not helping the situation, both in Singapore as well as the region and internationally. That the more people hear it being echoed, that there is this model called Singapore, and then you have people as far away as, for example, the PLO, making these statements that we should follow Singapore, and go down that same route. It's not something that I think is healthy. for long-term development. And therefore, I would wish sometimes that politicians in other countries pay just a little bit more, know a little bit more about the nuances, the finer calibrations of what's happening, and talk to the people in Singapore, talk to civil society actors, talk to opposition members. I know that years ago, I've had regular meetings with embassy officials, High Commission in Australia, High Commission is one of them. But of late, that has dropped off. I'm not sure if that's just me or whether they've not communicated with any of the other people, as I said, the activists and opposition politicians. But I think that's crucial. That's important to get an understanding and to inform the governments that things are happening in Singapore that we must be aware of.
We have time for one last question. John Piper in the front.
Thank you very much. I'm a great admirer of what you've been trying to do.
Thank you, sir.
I haven't worked in Singapore like Miles Cooper, but I did pass through in 1952 on my way back to Australia from studying. And I have to say, for those 4 months, which were very pleasant,
Lee Hsien Loong was not the Prime Minister at that time.
Mr. Marshall was your Prime Minister.
Yes.
And the political advisors in Malcolm McDonald's cabinet, who was running Southeast Asian Supremo, was to say to me, "You've got to be careful of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. He's a very dangerous left-winger." And he's preaching democracy, and I heard him speaking passionately about democracy. So, I got a bit confused as things changed, but I suspect there is a cynical an intellectual Mandarin approach that you suddenly realize that life is a lot easier without democracy, and a lot of people in other Western countries feel that sometimes. But I just wonder, how do you see things happening in Hong Kong? Because there you have a situation of a Chinese community who has the Confucian discipline about obeying authority and getting on with their business, but wanting democracy too. And do you think that there is a real problem that the Chinese community in Singapore has kind of taken the view that it will be dangerous if we become too cosmopolitan and too democratic? Is that a distortion? And China weighs very heavily with us, thinking where is it going? So I'd be very interested in your comment.
My good friend Martin Lee, again, some of you might know of him. He's retired since, I believe. But whenever we get together, we just sit and compare notes, and it's never a very happy conversation. He tells me that Hong Kong has all the freedoms, but no democracy, and vice versa in Singapore. I never knew quite how that worked as far as I'm concerned in Singapore. But in any case, this is that we're watching things very closely as how Hong Kong develops as well. I cannot imagine at any point in time, given the feistiness, if there's such a word, the feistiness of the Hong Kongers, that China would think of anything other than allowing them to continue on the path that they are already embarked. But having said that, when dictatorships get desperate and they see what's at stake and the amount that they have to lose, anything can happen. Deng Xiaoping, that I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, justifying the massacring of 200,000 students, and that's a number that he said. I have no idea how accurate that is. But I suspect that, if push comes to shove, dictatorships may sometimes just go off the deep end, and anything is possible. The point that I keep saying is that before it comes to that point, we have all this information, we have all this knowledge. Let us work to prevent it from coming to that stage. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's often said that the the degree of obloquy or attacks on a man, a politician, man or woman, is inversely proportional to the effect they have and the effectiveness they have in a society. And I'd just like to quote from Lee Hsien Loong in 2008 about Dr. Chi's book, Democratically Speaking, which there are a number of here if you wish to purchase it. He said, Chi Sun Juan is a liar, a cheat, and altogether an unscrupulous man. I could also add that I've had several of my own doctors who are familiar with such conduct tell me that he is near psychopath. Not very good grammar, but there, I think you get the message. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we are very pleased to have had Dr. Chi with us tonight, and his book is here if you wish to purchase it, and I now call upon one of our interns, Matt, to come and give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of the AIIA and everyone here tonight, would like to extend a hearty vote of thanks to Dr. Chi for providing his insight into not just the fascinating history of this remarkable nation, but also sharing with us his passion for the well-being of your country. You reflected at the end there to the power of ideas, and while Lee Hsien Loong might be credited by many as the father who had the idea of a modern Singapore, you have presented, in my opinion, a clear, justifiable and wholly convincing idea for a democratic Singapore. So please join me in thanking Dr. Chi for this evening.